All right, this is our third section in Unit 6. You will find this kind of ties together a lot of our other sections. I used to do this in a different order, but this kind of mixes in the agricultural that we had before and the urbanization later. The industrial side is what ties together. Notice there are a lot of state standards that are, most of them indirectly involved with this, but this is where, again, all these things for this unit are kind of tied together even though they're different subject matters. For our bracketing dates, there is no one bracketing dates here. This is where, like, that's why I had for 1877, not just the end of Reconstruction, but the industrial age. So we're in the middle of it. You'll see here in the very beginning, I'll be kind of talking about things that's stretching over a decade period of time that we have. All right, the first thing I always do in class, which I won't spend very much time on this video doing, is to think back if you were to go back 40 years ago. So right now it's 2020, so if you were to go back 40 years ago to 1980 and how different it would be. And I spent a little time kind of discussing this basically when everything comes about, it's like, no, we're really not that different, because how you got to school would have been the same way for a bus or a car, you walked, or your bike there. What you do in your spare time would have been a lot of the same things at that time in there. So we really haven't changed dramatically. Well, the one thing that has changed is a lot of stuff is just better or faster. Like TV, 1980 would have had, if you had cable, would have been 20 or so stations. Now you can stream things, or if you have cable, there's hundreds of stations that you have. You had telephones, but now you have your own phone with you. In fact, actually some people were thinking that, hey, it might have been a little bit better in the future. But at the same time, I said that where we haven't changed much from 40 years ago, how much did the change occur from 1880 to 1920? And you see with some of these pictures that I have on here, buildings in 1880 did not reach more than 2 or 3 stories. You had gas lanterns using kerosene. You did have telegrams, so if grandma has a birthday, you could send her a telegram through the telegraph on it. Long distance travel was by the train, but other travel was by horse and buggy or a wagon or something like that. You didn't have much for entertainment, for things that was outside the home. You did have some theaters and things like that, but it was not as much. Meanwhile, 20 years later, we have skyscrapers because of steel. We're gonna have the electric lights. So people come in and they push a button. It wasn't a switch at that time. You push a button and lights come on there. You have a telephone that you can call. We have cars. Now I have a picture of planes. You still use train for long distance. 1920 we weren't quite to the plane jet. But you have radios and for entertainment. The cities were lit up at night, were a lot safer, and you could go to the movie palaces. It was a silent movie because we're a couple of years away from talkies, but this is where there were just so many changes in that 40-year period. A lot more than what we've had in the last 40 years. Now, the number one thing that was kind of tying all this together, which our last section had a big part about the railroads, that is what was kind of tying this together. The interdependency of sections of the country. It's the basis of trade. A lot of the other major industries are some way or another related to the railroad. Even our financial crises of 1773 and 1883 and late 73 and 1893. Both of those were in one way or another tied to the railroad, which is called banking crisis there. That was the number one industry up until about the 1920s, and then we'd had the automobile industry and like how tech is today. Now, what changed this? This is an oversimplification, but if we break down, steel, oil, and electricity there. And this is where we had some really great men in history, and you see the picture of the 4 men there, and these are 4 that you do need to know about. There are some that we're going more in the notes, some of them are on the videos and readings that we have. But John D. Rockefeller with oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt with the railroads, Andrew Carnegie with steel, and J.P. Morgan as an investor in all kinds of different businesses would eventually own General Electric as well as U.S. Steel Corporation. History is repeating itself. Right now, we're kind of the same way, and I told my students to think back and what if we were to have in your great-great-grandchildren, and they're 100, 120 years from now, they're saying about this time period, we could be talking about another group of robber barons there that we have. We could be having an issue. It could be Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs. So again, Elon Musk. because it's the same thing. And when we're going to be talking about what these ways to get monopolies there, we kind of have history repeating itself with a lot of those big tech industries today there. All right, the first one that changed was steel. Andrew Carnegie is the person that's involved with this. Andrew Carnegie is definitely a rags to riches story for America. A child of immigrants. He was working basically as a child. Got lucky that somebody saw that he was smart, kind of gave him a start with things and showed him new things. But the biggest thing of all was he learned that in America, unlike his parents' Scotland, he could go to a library and teach himself things. And so he educated himself, and very early on would start with different businesses. Well, ultimately, he will go to Britain and see how they use this Bessemer process. Now, they had done it on a very small scale, and what he will do is make it on a very large scale. And we'll watch some videos showing this, but you see the picture of the thing with the sparks going out it. What you would do is you would combine together the iron ore, and you would have some other things, mainly some phosphates that are taken from limestone. And then you would, once it got hot, you would blow air through it there, and that would take out the impurities there. Once he made this process, it will make it where steel was a lot cheaper, stronger, it was lighter, and he will end up dominating the market. Now, he'll only have around a quarter of the steel mills, but he's going to control it in a different way. All right, we're going to do a reading next week in class and here, and you have some questions go with it that will go a lot more detail. But there are three main items that are needed: iron ore, coal, limestone. That's where the phosphates come from. The thing that was needed the most was the coal. That's why the plants will be along the Ohio River. And this is where I'd ask, all right, what is the mascot for the NFL team for Pittsburgh? It's the Steelers. And if you see the three stars, they have the three rivers. They used to play at Three River Stadium there. But that's where they could bring the coal in. Now, the iron ore that came from the Lake Superior region would come out of Great Lakes, and then they would have the last bit travel by train there. Now, Andrew Carnegie would own coal mines, he would own the limestone mines, he would own iron ore mines, he would own the transportation to get there. He did not have to depend on anyone. What we're going to see here in a little bit was called vertical integration. But what we talk about a lot more and go more details and kind of here is the impact it has. The steel will make the cities grow. Instead of buildings only being 2 or 3 stories tall, we have multi-story buildings that we have. And another thing that occurred at this time was Elisha Otis invented the safety elevator. He didn't invent the elevator, but the safety elevator, which made it where it didn't come crashing down. So yeah, you see that in movies and TVs. That really doesn't happen very often. We're going to have the subways, the rail lines that are going to expand the cities out. Just think of New York City, where it was the 5 different boroughs that you had, and then Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, the Bronx. They all come together to make one big city, and they're put together by the subways and the rail lines that you have. Now, we'll go over stuff with monopolies, but this is where one way to have a monopoly, and if you see vertical integration, you need to think of monopolies, again, when you dominate it. Andrew Carnegie was able to use this style to control the market, and again, he didn't own but around a quarter of the steel mills. But what he would do is, if he had a competitor that was not working with him, he could drop the price, sell his steel real cheap, and then raise the price in his mines and the transportation, because probably somewhere along the line they're using things that he's also making. And what would end up happening is it would drive them out of business. Now, J.P. Morgan's going to keep popping up in here. J.P. Morgan was a businessman. When he died, a lot of people thought he was the richest person in the world. He wasn't, but he was extremely rich. But he had other investors. But he will purchase U.S. Steel from Andrew Carnegie in 1900. It'll be the first billion-dollar corporation. And today's money, that would be over $1 trillion, which just in the last 2 years, we've had our first trillion-dollar corporations, and Apple and then now Amazon there. So that's where, again, I would repeat about how history is repeating itself here. All right, our second thing is oil. We had done some oil before. We were welling was used early on for the industries for it. We will have kerosene that's coming in lamps. We'll have an oil boom in Pennsylvania. Most people don't think of Pennsylvania, but that's where Edward Drake would have it. And then what we'll end up having is these refineries that are going to take that raw oil and make it into the various products. John D. Rockefeller will end up and controlling at one time, I believe it's 94, 95, 96% of the refineries in America there. And that's what's called horizontal consolidation. And again, you think monopolies when you think that. He had a key part there, that the oil, other people had the risk of mining it there, and if they found it, they made a lot of money, but if they did a mine and didn't find it, then they lost a lot of money. He didn't have that. But the oil comes in the refineries, and at that time the number one product was kerosene that you would have. But you think of the plastics, tar, asphalt, all kinds of things that come from it. Gasoline is one thing you normally think of. At that time, it was a byproduct there, and actually a lot of the refineries just literally had pipes dumping gasoline out in the rivers at that time. Now, you think about if every time a person was buying something made of oil that John D. Rockefeller was making money, you can see how if we were to convert his money to modern day, he would be the richest man in United States history. There, Carnegie would be second, and then it's depending on whether things are right now. Jeff Bezos is number one and would probably be third all time, but there, unless Bill Gates, when he was at his highest, might be when converted for modern money there. But Rockefeller was actually well above what Bezos is today. Our third thing is electricity. Now, Thomas Edison will make thousands of patents, and actually it won't be just him. He will have scientists working under him. Most people know of the light bulb that he tested, and he makes the lasting light bulb on there. But the phonograph, so the early record, basically the motion picture camera, we're going to have it where batteries that you have. He will use DC power with it. Now, I say the connection to J.P. Morgan. Later on, J.P. Morgan, who invested in this company, will end up actually undercutting Thomas Edison and what was Edison Electric. And pretty much overnight, Edison is going to be working for J.P. Morgan there. A lot of his research was done in New Jersey, but he had a home here in Florida. And this is where I'll kind of tell some different stories in class. But his neighbors were Henry Ford and Henry Firestone, and they would actually work together for various things that they had problems. One reason why for a long time Ford vehicles always had Firestone tires, because they wintered together down in Fort Myers. He had a lab that he worked there. Now, one of his most famous students was Tesla. I know those of you really into science will be able to tell a little bit more there, but what he did was actually the biggest thing that he had was for the AC current there, and then we ended up having a rival between Edison and Tesla for different power plants that we'll have. Ultimately, Tesla's idea with AC current will be what wins. Person that you maybe didn't know about is George Westinghouse. We still have Westinghouse Corporation. What he made is what today we call a transformer. You think about it like out on the road, that power that goes through that line will kill you there. Meanwhile, if you stick your finger in the socket or some metal in the socket, it won't feel good, but you'll get a shock there. What he does is he transforms from the high voltage down to the lower voltage or amps that we have there, and that's for him for making it safer. Here's for some of you that are into the Edison joke, because Edison stole a lot of his stuff from what was the brainchild of Tesla. All right, a bunch of other inventions that we have. I only have a few on here. Some of you wrote in your impact essay about Christopher Sholes there, where he invents a typewriter, which even today, and the QWERTY board, QWERT, where the side of that, it was actually designed in the beginning to slow people down. If you've ever played with one of those old-timey typewriters, if you go too fast, the bars get caught and then you have to pull each one back in order. So they actually purposely made it where some of the letters that are used the most are by your left hand, since most people are right-hand dominant there. We have made new keyboards, but people don't like them because they've always been taught for using the others that they would have. The telephone with Alexander Graham Bell there, and the impact it will have in it. Kodak camera, George Eastman, and Eastman Kodak will become one of our biggest corporations until recent years. He didn't invent the camera, but what he did is, you kind of think of where you see pictures of things in the past, and you would have a camera, but in today's money, to have a picture taken, it would cost you maybe like $50 to $100. So you didn't go, and unless you were really rich, you didn't have very many pictures taken. What Eastman made was a camera that middle class could do. So at that time, it might cost $1 a picture. So you're going to be able to do a lot more. It's amazing today where we take more pictures in America today, I think, in one day than what was made up until about 2000 in that time in there. All right, the safety razor. Gillette didn't make it in there, and you notice the name Gillette from the company. Make the razor, but he made it where it's a safety razor, which pretty obvious than the difference where it was a lot safer to use than the straight blade. Thousands and thousands of patents were being issued, and there was a quote from someone in the patent office who figured they were going to close down it because nothing else could be invented. But what they found is once you invent something, you actually open the door to a whole lot more. Research and development is going to be really important in corporations as they're going to try to go and have more and more things that they're inventing, and that way they can sell in here. All right, I've used this term before, the robber barons there. By 1900, we will have over 4,000 millionaires. Most of them claim to be self-made men, but that actually wasn't the truth. Most, and just like today, most of the people were born into wealth. But there are some, like Carnegie, that truly were. Rockefeller's another example of it. And it's like today. I mean, Bill Gates was a self-made man because rich. So there are those that have it, but a large percentage of the millionaires, just like today, the richest people, a highest percentage of them are ones that inherited a lot of money there. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan are ones that you must know on here. Vanderbilt with his railroads, another one that you need to know offhand. Gustavus Swift. We normally don't think of this, but with those steel cans and the meat packing that we have. Isaac Singer, he did not invent the sewing machine. Elias Howe did, but what he will do is figure a way to mass produce it. And you see that picture of that sewing machine. For decades, it didn't change very much for it. And think about how much work was saved by a sewing machine, going from hand sewing to that. For our robber barons, this is a book, an AP US history. We go a lot into it and we'll read things in it. But Andrew Carnegie wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth. And what he said is pretty much God basically blessed him on purpose. But he put the purpose so to use that wealth to give back to the community. He didn't just say that, he actually did it. And this is where he will give back millions and millions of dollars. There are over 70 libraries that he gives money to. Because remember I told you that when he was younger, he was able to self-taught. He will start with different universities. Some of you know of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburg there. Now, be a little bit on the cynical side. Some people say that he was trying to clear his image because he was just seen as this rich old guy that didn't do anything. In there, the Homestead strike, where we had strikers that were killed. I'll talk about that in a little bit. In here, the Johnstown flood, which was one of the natural accident that all the people in this town, or a lot of people in the town of Johnstown, were flooded and killed when the dam that was made for a bunch of rich people, that Carnegie was one of them, had of like a country club above. So, but he did give back to money, and so did, and actually Rockefeller did too, even though people thought Rockefeller was a stingy old guy. And in many ways, we have the gospel of wealth today, because Bill Gates is a great example of someone that is just giving away almost all of his money that he has. Don't feel sorry for his children. They're still going to get a couple $100 million. But this is where Bill Gates kind of goes by the gospel of wealth there, and is giving away billions of dollars with the Gates Foundation. And here's where the answer: the rich have the moral responsibility to use their wealth to improve society. Again, he said God blessed them for that. Now, he was a ruthless businessman, but he believed this. All right, we're going to have a hodgepodge of things in this part here that's kind of related with this. Horatio Alger is a writer you need to know of. He wrote a lot in what were, again, those dime novels that were the cheaper paperback books. A lot of his books were called the Pluck and Luck series, and pretty much it was almost like a Lifetime movie or something like that. It was the same story over and over again, but written in there. But basically the story of someone that was poor and then became rich in there. Hard work, maybe a little bit of luck in there. Farmer moves to the city, has an idea for something, for a business. struggles for a bit, but then is successful. Andrew Carnegie's story would pretty much be about the idea that he would have. They were feel-good books, but it also spread with that idea of the American dream. Social Darwinism. This is something that I don't have much in the notes. We're going to have some readings that will have more on it. But if you remember, we introduced Social Darwinism back in Reconstruction, where this is where some people when races believed that some races were superior to others. Now, in business, Social Darwinism said the stronger business will survive. And this is where business robber barons would say that is fine. That's why they could do their practice there. And Carnegie would take down anybody else, Rockefeller in there, because they are stronger. And again, it was a kind of a principle that they had at that time. Laissez-faire and caveat emptor are two different words you're going to need to know. Caveat emptor is going to come up a little bit later on. But laissez-faire is our economics term. You're going to see it when you take economics as well as government next year. It means hands off, and so the government was not supposed to do regulation. And for the longest time, that was our philosophy in the United States, is there was a hands off and not have regulation. The progressive movement will change that. The other phrase, caveat emptor, that's going to be a little bit later on, means to the buyer beware. And where today we're very sue happy and sue about all kinds of things that go wrong. In those days, it was you bought something, you got sick from it. Well, you took that risk when you bought it. Again, a lot of that's going to change in the progressive era. All right, corporations. This is where you need to know with this. A corporation is actually a legal person in there. Now, what you do is when you have a corporation and a business, you have shares of stocks. Now, it could be a private corporation and only a few members of a family own it, and you do that for liability reasons. In here, and this is where that bottom line is about the idea of limited liability. That way, if something happens, like when I had my business that I made fishing tackle, I actually made it as a corporation there. If somebody was to sue the business, they could sue the business but only get the assets of the business. They couldn't come to me after me personally, like if I had a sole proprietorship or a partnership with someone in here. So what will end up happening is this where business will set things up, and this is the way a lot of our businesses are still today for major business and corporations. The 14th Amendment, which was made for civil rights mainly for black men when it first started, will actually then be used then for corporations, and the idea that corporations are people there. Even in recent years, we've had the Supreme Court case of the Citizens United case about corporations contributing money. And the Supreme Court has upheld that a corporation is a legal entity, so they are able to contribute to campaigns because that is a version of freedom of speech in elections. Monopolies, where we've used this word in different ways. Please, I'm trying to make this simple to you. When you see various things there, it'll be called a pool, it'll be called a pool arrangement, a trust, a holding company. You'll see vertical integration, horizontal consolidation. Just to make things simple, just remember that it's a monopoly where a person or a business is trying to control an industry in here. During the late 1800s and then the early 1900s, we will start cracking down on the monopolies. And the progressive era will go more into what the government's doing to try to break them down in here. They will start, though, in 1890. So, I said, if you see trust, you automatically should think monopoly. So the Sherman Antitrust Act meant the Sherman Anti-Monopoly Act. It was supposed to stop monopolies, and it was very well written. There was one major problem with it, and the reason why it didn't have much effect at the time is they really didn't have much punishment. So what would happen is you were wrong, but you're not punished. Be kind of like if you're driving your car down the road, if you know, the speed limit says it's 60, but if you're driving 80, nothing happens to you, you're probably going to drive faster. Ironically, it was ended up using against labor unions at that time. Now, the reason why you still have to know it, and this is going to be like one of about 15 laws in our U.S. history that you do have to know, there is the fact that this will be a start in there. And later on, we're going to have the Clayton Antitrust Act, which will build upon the progressive era. It will have punishments, and this is where this was at least a start of trying to control these businesses and have regulation. Major flaw was lack of enforcement provisions. All right, I'm summarizing with here From the Civil War, actually, up and through to World War II, our economy is going to go up and down, up and down. Wide booms that we'll have in there. We don't have quite that in today because we have things in our set up in our businesses to try to go and make sure we don't go up too fast or down too fast in here. But we will have some major downturns. 1873, 1893, both of them ultimately will come for the banks. The Panic of 1893 was the worst we had had in U.S. history up to that time. We will have extreme unemployment. People will be coming and marching and saying the government should do something. But at that time, the philosophy was no, the government does not get involved. That will change later on in the Great Depression. Here's one thing about that time period. We had a huge divide between the rich and the poor. 1899, the average salary in the factories was men about 500, women about half that. But Carnegie made $23 million that year in there. And at that time, we did not have all the income tax and things. So he was making there. So again, this is where we have in the history of the United States, we've had time periods that the rich and the poor are the biggest divide. The largest will be the 1920s, the second largest will be the Gilded Age, and I believe right now we're the third largest gap that we have between the rich and the poor. Our taxing policies are going to still be based on the old ideas of using excise taxes on certain products and then tariffs on imports there. This is what we had for over 100 years, and we will make a lot of these changes then in the progressive era that we see in here. Now, I say, how does this fit with the populist ideas? In our last section, talked about the Farmers Alliance, the Ocala Demands, the Populist Party. They were doing things and fighting not just for farmers, but for those factory workers there. And again, a lot of the changes that they proposed in the late 1800s will come about during the progressive era in the early 1900s there. All right, our last section part in here is about unions. I don't go too deep into the unions there. We had unions early in U.S. history. Some of the first ones were the textile mills and the Lowell system with women. We're going to have our National Labor Union there, but nothing was really that big until for a little bit. I always like to mention the Molly Maguires. It's not really a true union, but it was coal miners, and whenever things got where it was too unsafe in their business, they would basically threaten their bosses that they're going to kill them if they don't make things better, and they would sign it Molly Maguires. It wasn't a union there, but it was workers uniting together. But there wasn't anything big for a union until we get the Knights of Labor. And it's going to be led by Terence Powderly. It's going to have both skilled and unskilled labor. Now, there's going to be a problem with it because we're going to have a riot, the Haymaker Square riots there, where an anarchist is going to set off a bomb. It's going to kill and injure a lot of people. Now, here's a problem that unions have, is the ideas of unions. Some of those ideas are then built more upon when you think about Marxism and communism. And then we would have also anarchists that will then go along with them. So that will be a downfall for a lot of the unions, is that they're associated with those extreme groups that we have. The Knights of Labor, though, their main problem besides that will be that they accept unskilled labor. And they will die out in 1890. Now, the one that will start up and will be successful is the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. And for most of our history since the late 1800s, this has been our biggest union. Not always there, but even today it is our biggest or our second biggest union that we have there. It is led by Samuel Gompers in the beginning in here. What he did is he aimed on what he called bread and butter philosophy. He's not saying we want our salary doubled. What he said is we want to get a living wage, or we want to have our day go from a 14-hour workday to a 12-hour workday, and eventually 10 hours, so that unions work to get that. We need to have safer workplaces there. We should get off on Sundays there. So it was basic ideas that they had there. Major thing they did was only had skilled workers, did not include unskilled workers. And I kind of I'll use in the class an example, and I'll say like the people that are welders, plumbers, electricians, and then those that are pretty much just putting pieces together there that I can train in a short period of time. If the people that are just putting the pieces together there and that don't have any skills, they go on strike, I don't worry about them because I can replace them very easily. But what if my welders, what if my electricians, my plumbers, and those skilled people, if they go on strike? So that is where this union will be successful there. And again, it is still around today as one of the largest. Now, no matter what time period we're talking about, 1800s, we're going to come back for the 1920s, and then in the 1950s, we'll have sections about unions. There are certain vocabulary words that you need to know. The first one is the idea of what a union has, which is collective bargaining. Now, collective is together, bargaining is negotiation. So together they're going to negotiate. That's the strength that a union has. All the workers are together and they're trying to negotiate, whether it be for a shorter workday or to have a break or to have better health care. Now, the main weapon that they have and still have is strikes there, because if they threaten to go on strike, it'll shut down the business. Another word that's associated with that you need to know are scabs. These are the replacement workers. If it's unskilled, it's easier to have it. And I had this question, even though it's more for the future, what's a sit-down strike? Well, a sit-down strike is when instead of you protesting outside of the building, you just sit down in the factory and you don't work. That way, if they bring in scabs, they can't work there either. So we're going to see that used in the 1900s in here. Again, a problem that unions have is a lot of times they're associated with anarchists, communists, socialists, which in other parts of the world, it's not just the United States, other parts of the world this is growing. They will try to get immigrants involved. Now it's going to be ironic because the unions don't want any more immigrants, but when the immigrants do come in there, they're going to try to get them involved in the union very quickly there. And during the Red Scare and other time periods, they're going to be basically used in their fights against communism because of the people that are associated with unions and the communists in here. Why did they grow in here? This is in there, and some of the things that they did. Again, working hours, where it was nothing uncommon for a 12-hour workday there. Carnegie at one time working in a steel mill, you worked 12-hour days, all 7 days a week. To get Sunday off, you had to work a double shift. So you didn't really get it off, you just worked 2 of your shifts back to back, and then you got 24 hours off after working 24 hours. Big thing they worked for was safety conditions and making it where it was a lot safer for the working conditions. One of the things that caused this to happen will be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which I'm going to show a picture of that happens in New York City there. And before 9/11 was the biggest workplace group of deaths that we had in New York City. We're going to have company towns, and I described this a little bit before when I was talking about the Pullman, but the Pullman strike, where that factory, the entire town, and everybody who works in the factory lives in the town. They buy theirs from the store that's owned by the company. They pay their rent to it there, and this is where when they would basically cut the pay, but the rent was the same there, and they had no choice with this. Unions are going to be against child labor. There, and one of the main union leaders that will be fighting and will be kind of seen for here will be Mother Jones. That's there. Now, it wasn't that they were worried about the children hurting their fingers and that would be part of it. But the main reason what they were worried about is child labor could be paid less. So they didn't want to have it. That's competition. Again, that's why unions would be against any more immigration. Now, again, once the immigrants were there, they try to get them to join the unions. Here's a little meme, and here, cheers to unions, because the unions are the only reason you have weekends, breaks, vacation, overtime pay, 8-hour workday, sick leave, etc. It's not the only reason, but it is a large reason for what they fought for that you have. All right, there's a couple of strikes to know. The one thing that you do need to know here is until Teddy Roosevelt, the union almost always sided with the factory owners whenever there was a strike in here. So you don't have to know these in depth, but here's a couple that you just be familiar with. Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mill, he was actually gone at that time, but there will be a strike. He hires what are called Pinkerton agents, which is pretty much like a private army. He had the scabs come in there, and then when some of the strikers were coming after them, they shot and they killed some of the strikers. Made for a lot of bad press. The union was then broken up by the National Guard, so the government brought in the National Guard. This is where Carnegie got a bad name even though it was Henry Clay Frick that did most of the dirty work, but most people, again, it was Carnegie's factory. And so when he came back to the United States after being gone for a while, he was trying to make his reputation better, and that's where some people say the idea for him giving back so much came. The Pullman's strike. Now this is where the company town, and again when they cut the wages but the rent didn't, we're going to have this guy by the name of Eugene Debs that's going to emerge from there. Eugene Debs is later on going to run for president, multiple elections for the Socialist Party, getting almost 10% of the vote in the 1912 election that we have. All right, here's where for you notice for different things, this chart, and where I say to read it. And you may not be able to zoom in on it too well, but here's where you're going to see that most of our strikes are in the north and the west. You don't see it in the south in there, where the darkened area is where there was the strike activity in there. So again, most of it was in the north and the west. Here's where, again, the idea for this question that that the government is supporting it, but for vocabulary, an injunction here. An injunction is when it means a court order there. All right, the second industrial revolution, which this is basically called in there, will make it where we have extreme differences between the rich and the working people, those robber barons and the people working for them. But the thing about it is, Americans, our poor, were twice as off better than the best countries in Europe there. And this is where it's kind of seen that sometimes as a rising tide raises all boats. There. So yes, they were poor, and we're going to see in the progressive era a lot of the things that were needing to be done to help out the poor. But we had things better than any place else in the world in there. And this is where I say by the end of the 19th century, we are number one in the world. We're the number one merchant marine. We're the number one for exports. We don't realize it there when we get to the end of the 19th century. It won't be till World War I that we realize that, hey, we are actually bigger than those European countries. We are number one there. And then after World War I, where we didn't want to take that leadership role yet in the world.